In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at building an API using Couchbase, NoSQL, and Node.js. This tutorial is actually going to be one of two. It's not going to be a two-part tutorial. I'm just going to create two different tutorials on two different ways on building this API. So this one is going to focus on Couchbase's NQL query technology, so the query technology that allows you to write SQL-like queries. And then the next tutorial will actually show you how to use an ODM called Ottoman, which is very similar to MongoDB's Mongoose tool. So with that said, a few things are required in order to make this successful. You actually do need Couchbase Server installed on your computer. You could be running it locally, it could be running in the cloud, wherever you want. But this Couchbase Server instance needs to be running Couchbase Server 4.0 or higher. I already do have it running on my computer, so we're actually going to start by building our fresh project. So this is going to be an API. It's going to be a very simple API, but it'll walk you through each of the steps on being successful at building applications. So on the desktop, go ahead and create a new directory. I'm going to create my directory called NQL example and navigate into this new directory. We do need to initialize this new Node.js project, so we can actually say npm init-y, and this will give us a base to work off of, at which point I'm going to open this project in Atom. So that's my IDE that I'm going to be using. You can use whatever IDE you want. That's completely up to you. So I'm going to say Atom dot, and it just opened up my IDE. As you can see, I have one package.json file in there from the command that we just created. What we're going to do next is we're going to import all of the necessary dependencies that make this project successful. So we're going to say npm install. We're going to include Couchbase. So this is the Couchbase Node.js SDK. We're going to include Express for Express Framework. We're going to include Body Parser for handling JSON body requests. And we're going to include UUID for generating unique values. And we're going to say save, --save. All right, so with all the dependencies installed, if we go back to our editor, we'll notice that they are now part of package.json because we did use the save attribute. So now in the future cases, we can just type in npm install, and it'll go ahead and install all of our dependencies for us. The next thing we want to do is we want to create the files that we're going to be using in our project. So you can create these however you want. I'm going to be creating them with the terminal. So I'm going to say I want to create an app.js file. I want to create a models.js file. And I want to create a routes.js file. So app is going to be where all of our bootstrapping logic goes to really connect to Couchbase Server, get everything set up. Routes is going to be all of our API endpoints, and then models is going to be all of our interaction with the database. So before we actually start coding this stuff, we do need to make sure that we have the proper indexes created on Couchbase Server, because we will be using NQL queries, which require indexes to be created. So go ahead and navigate to your Couchbase Server dashboard, and you can see that I don't have any indexes created for the bucket that I'm going to be using. The bucket I'm going to be using is going to be actually called example. So we want to create an index for that. So if you're using Couchbase Server 4.5 or higher, you can use the Query Workbench. If Query Workbench is not available to you, you can use the command line tool that ships with Couchbase. But let's go ahead and type in create primary index on example using GSI and execute. So you can see the index was created. For this example, we only need one index. We're not going to be handling massive amounts of data. You definitely want to create your indexes appropriately depending on how your queries are going to be constructed. With the index created, let's go back into our editor and our command prompt, and we're going to start with the app.js file. The first thing inside of our app.js file is we're going to include the necessary dependencies that were downloaded. So we're going to say var express equals require express. I'm going to say var body parser equals require body parser. And then finally var Couchbase equals require Couchbase. So we're not including UUID yet. It will be used in our other files. This is just our bootstrap file. So the next thing we want to do is we want to initialize Express framework. So to initialize Express framework, let's go to say var app equals Express. And now it's initialized. We do need to configure our body parser though. So we're going to say app.use body parser.json. And we're also going to say app.use body parser.url encoded extended true colon. All right, so body parser set up, Express is set up. The next thing we want to set up is our connection to Couchbase server. So again, mine is running locally on my machine. You can host it wherever you want, but we're going to say var cluster equals new couchbase.cluster. So I'm going to say couchbase : localhost. So that'll connect to my cluster. The next thing I want to do is I want to open up a particular bucket on that cluster. So I'm going to say bucket equals cluster.openBucket, and the bucket is going to be called example. I do want to export this so that way it can be used in all of the files, so all 3 files. So what I want to do is I want to say module.exports.bucket equals bucket. So now we can use bucket in all of our files. So the next thing we want to do is we want to say what our route file is. So we can say var routes equals require routes.js. And we also want to pass in the initialized Express instance. Finally, we can define what port our server will be started on and go ahead and start it. And I'm going to go ahead and print out when it's running successfully. All right, so at this point, our app.js file is complete. There wasn't a whole lot to it. It was just setting everything up. So the next thing that we can do is we can actually visit routes. So we want to define what endpoints are going to be available to our application. So let's go ahead and start bootstrapping this file. We can say var app router equals function. And then at the end of the day, we want to say module.exports equals app router. Perfect. So our actual routes, what we're going to be planning towards is we want a way to be able to, we're going to have essentially people and we're going to have comments. So just a comment system for people. So we want a way to be able to list all people. So get all people from the database. We want to be able to get people by a certain ID. We want to be able to create new people, and we want to be able to add comments for a particular individual. So that will allow us to establish some sort of relationship in this case. So let's go ahead and lay the groundwork here. We're going to say app.get, and this one's going to be a person endpoint. So the goal with this particular endpoint, because we're not passing in any parameters, is to get all people. But we're actually not going to fill it in yet. We're going to copy, and we're going to create another endpoint. This endpoint is going to be still person, but we're going to accept a person ID. So this will allow us to get one person from the database. Next up, we want to do another endpoint, but this time it's going to be a post endpoint. So it's going to be post against person, and this is going to be for creating or saving a new, kind of updating a new person. So we do have one more endpoint. This one endpoint is going to be for comments. It's going to allow us to create a new comment. So we're actually never going to get comments on their own. They're always going to be retrieved with people. So after we created a comment, that's the only endpoint that we need. So we have, what is this, 4 endpoints. before we start designing these endpoints, we probably want to define the data model, so that way we have a real function to call. So inside of the models.js file, what we want to do is we want to import a few dependencies here. For UUID equals require UUID. For NQL query equals require Couchbase .NQL query. And then finally, we want to be able to get that open bucket. So we're going to say our bucket require app .bucket. So these are our dependencies. And inside of this, we're going to have two different models. You could easily break this up into more files, but for simplicity, we're going to keep all of our models inside of this one file. So what we're going to do is we're going to say function person model equals, oops, there we go. We're also going to say function comment model and then at the end of the day, we want to be able to export both of these functions to be used in other files. So the file in particular, routes.js. All right, so at this point we can start filling in these models based on what our endpoints are expecting. So first off, let's start with the NQL query. So this is going to be the foundation on kind of what this example is about, to show, hey, this is an easy way to query for data in Couchbase. This is one of many ways to query for data, actually. So let's go ahead and say person model equals, person model dot get all equals function. And inside of this function, we actually want to pass in a callback, so that way our endpoint, so that way all of this can be asynchronous. So inside of the person model, this is actually going to be a massive query. This is going to be the largest of the queries probably in this entire application, because the goal here, so as far as our model goes, we're going to have this person document. This person document is going to have all kinds of JSON in it. Inside of this person document, we're going to have an array. That array is going to have IDs in it. Those IDs are going to link to other documents. So it's sort of how you would do it in a relational database, but there's no constraints. So this query is just really going to join all of that together and return all of the data we need, because at the end of the day, we don't care about IDs. When we query for people, IDs do nothing for us. We want the actual comment data instead, and that's what we're going to accomplish here. So we're going to say var statement equals select, and this really touches up on your querying skills. So we're actually not going to store the ID inside of the document itself. Instead, we're going to look at the metadata about the document. But you know what? Before we do that, let's just we'll come to that next. So we're going to select from. In this case, we're selecting from bucket._name, which is going to be example. So this would be a pretty simple query. Notice I'm not selecting anything, so this query wouldn't actually run, but at least we're laying the foundation here. So what we can actually do is let's start selecting some of that data. So again, meta. Let's alias this as person. So meta person dot ID. We want person dot name. We want person dot email. And then this is going to be the big one. This is going to be where all of our relationship happens. And I know we're getting ahead of ourselves. We haven't actually seen the data model yet. But let's just go ahead and assume for now, and I'll break it down inside of the dashboard on what all of this looks like as well. So what we want to say is we want to do a subquery, and there's many ways to do this. You can actually do You can do joins, you can do whatever you want. I feel the most comfortable with subqueries in this case. So we want to say timestamp. We want to say message from. And this is where things might get a little weird, but we're actually going to join or do the subquery, you can say, from the same bucket. So with Couchbase, all of your documents will go in one bucket per application, and you're going to have many different types of documents inside of that one bucket. So we're selecting it from that particular bucket, and we're saying use keys person.comments. So comments is going to be an array of keys, and this will allow us to select all other documents based on those keys inside of this subquery. So unlike a relational database, you can actually have multi-column, multi-row subqueries that will return data. So it makes it very convenient. So we're aliasing that as comments. We're not quite done yet though. We want to say where person.type equals person. So we are going to have a property inside of that JSON document called type, and this will tell us what type of document it is. So we only want to get the people documents. So that's our big long nasty query. Depending on how much you like to write queries, this could be really good. Or maybe the next tutorial that I write will actually benefit you more. So it's two different ways to solve a problem here, and this is the first way. So with the statement created, now we need to go ahead and parse this into a nickel query. All right, so that'll take our string, parse it into a nickel query, at which point we can actually run it. So we're going to say bucket.query. We're going to pass in that query string as well as a function. And depending on the success or the failure of this function, we're going to perform a certain task. So if error, return callback error, and then null. So it's going our callback that we pass from our endpoint function is going to be some kind of error here. Otherwise, we're going to say callback null, and then whatever the result is. All right, so in theory, at this point, we do have a functional database function, but we have no route that really points to it. So what we want to do is let's go ahead and finish off that first route. So before we do that, we have to import the person model. And then we can say person model dot get all. We're going to pass it in a function callback, remember. So result is in theory going to be people. If there was an error, we're going to respond with some kind of 400 error. It could be whatever error you want. But if it doesn't error out, we actually want to send the success. So the result. So I'm going to save it. It's now saved. Let's go ahead and run it and see how far we get at this point. Make sure there's no errors up until now. So in our terminal, we're going to say node app.js. And you can see that there was some kind of error. And that's because I didn't pass in app. Remember, we're passing in app from our app.js file. So in theory, let's try to run it again. It's now listening. We don't have a user interface for it, so instead I'm going to be using a tool called Postman. It's a free tool. It allows you to make HTTP requests against APIs. So what we want to do is that should be our endpoint, localhost 3000/person. I'm going to say get And I'm going to say send. There was errors of some sort, so that's not good. So maybe we have a mistake in our query. So let's go ahead and open up our code. Go to model.js. And let's say console.log error. We're going to rerun it. And I'm going to say send. And let's look at our logs this time. So it says ambiguous reference to person field. So let's take a look at our query. So it looks like the reason is probably because I forgot to add a plus at the end of line 10. So let's go ahead and try it again. Oops. Keep forgetting which window I'm on. Go ahead and send it again. And you can see that it returned just an empty array because we have no data currently in our database. So at this point, it's probably a good idea to start adding data to the database. So that could actually be done inside of our model. So we're going to start with our model again and work our way backwards into our route. We want to create a save function. So person model dot save equals function. We need to figure out what kind of data we want to pass to it. So let's just call it data. We're going to have a callback again. And this time we're actually not going to use a nickel query. We can if we want, but in this case, I feel like it makes more sense to not. So it's completely up to you though. So we're going to create our JSON object. Let's call it person. And we're going to say name. So we're actually constructing the format that we want to save it as, because just like with any kind of database, you don't want to just trust what your user has given you. You want to parse it out and sanitize it first. So we're going to say there's a name. There's going to be a first name, and this is going to come from data.name.first. There's going to be a last name, data.name.last. We're going to have an email, and this one's going to be data.email, and then comments, data.comments. So there are some default properties that we're not going to take in from user input. For example, we're going to have a type. This type is going to be person, and then we're going to have a timestamp, and this one's actually going to be new date. So that's the type of data that we're going to save. This is what it's going to look like in the database as well. But before we get to that far, we're going to say var id equals data.id, and I'll explain this in a second. So what we're doing here is we're actually doing a ternary operation. We're doing this because, well, if no ID was passed, let's go ahead and create a new document. Let's go ahead and create a new document, generate a new document ID for it, and use that. If an ID was passed in, let's go ahead and use that ID, and we're actually going to replace that document. So it's an upsert. That's our goal here. The save function is going to be a create or a replace. So with that said, we can say bucket dot upsert ID person function error and then result. And you'll see there's a trend here. It's going to look very similar to what we've already done. And for that reason, I'm actually going to copy from a previous function, and we're going to return either the error or the result. So in this case, we're going to go back to routes, and we're going to finish this off. So we're going to say person model. Oh, I'm in the wrong endpoint. So I'm going to say person model dot save, and we're going to pass in the request body, and we're going to pass in a function, a callback function. And likewise, to keep things simple, just going to copy and paste from the previous. So in theory, let's go ahead and run this again and see if we can get something to save. So I restarted our server here. You could easily do some kind of live reload. I know Node.js has this option. But in this case, I'm just restarting. It's very fast. So going back, I'm going to change my request into a post request for the body. I'm going to enter a JSON string right here, a JSON object. So name again is going to be an object. So first Nick, last Raboy, and then we're also going to include an email. And that should actually do it. So let's go ahead and send it. And it says data is not defined. So let's see why it's not defined. All right, so going to models. So inside of models, we actually, for timestamp, I put data. It should actually be date. So if I rerun this, oops, and I click send again, you can see that it was successful. It returned a compare and swap value. So if I go to the dashboard and Couchbase and go to the buckets and go to documents and click on a document, so this is the information that was saved exactly how we expected it. This also gives us an opportunity to test our endpoint for getting all documents. So I changed it back to get. I'm going to click send. And you can see that it returned all of our documents, just being that one document, and there was nothing in it. So now we want to finish off the rest of our endpoints. They should be rather easy in comparison, but let's go ahead and finish off. We're going to create our next endpoint for getting a particular person ID. So inside of the person ID, we're actually going to say inside of our model, we're going to say person model dot get by ID equals function. We're going to pass it some data again. And in this case, again, you could use a nickel query, but I'm actually going to do a lookup based on the ID. It's much faster. So when you are presented with this option in Couchbase, it definitely makes more sense to do it that way. But if you need to write a complex query, definitely nickel is the way to go. So let's go ahead and say, we're going to say bucket.get. We're going to get by the ID. So in this case, we can say ID, person, whatever we want to expect in the incoming data. And like always, we have error or result. And I'm going to copy the same basic stuff from the other function. But this time, because we're doing a get rather than a nickel query, we actually want to make sure we return only the value in this case. So we return the value, go back to routes. What we want to do is we want to say person model dot get by ID. We're going to pass in the request params, and then function error result. And I'm going to copy this again. Perfect. So let's go ahead and give that a shot. I'm going to reboot. It's running again. I'm going to open up my Postman, but before I do that, I'm going to copy the ID of the currently saved document. I'm going to do slash, and I'm going to paste that in. I'm going to send it. All right, so first argument needs to be a string or buffer. So let's go ahead and look at that. So we're passing in params. Oh, so you know what? I'm expecting an ID. So let's keep it as an ID. Let's send it again. This time, instead of an array, it returned one document, the exact document that I was hoping for. So this leaves us with really one more function. This one's going to be for creating comments, and then in theory, they should be expanded to show that, you know what, they're not IDs. When we're returning them, they're actually going to be comments. So going back into our model, so models.js, we're going to say comment model dot create equals function. We're going to accept data. We're going to accept a callback. And then in it, it's going to look very similar to our person model save. So we're going to say var comment equals And how do we want it to look? We want it to look like message, and this is going to be data.message. We want timestamp to be new date, and we want it to have a type. So that way it helps us when it comes to querying. So that's all we want in terms of comment. So now what we want to do is we want to say var id equals uuid.v4. So in this case, we're not doing any kind of upsert. It's just we're only creating comments. We cannot edit comments that we create. I'm going to say bucket.insert id comment function error result. We're going to copy some things. But you know what? We don't want to return just a compare and swap value. We actually want to return the comment itself. But the comment itself, it doesn't have an ID in it because we're actually returning the comment that we created on 57 through 61. So that can be fixed by saying comment.id equals ID. So when we return it, the goal here is because we want to be able to manipulate it in our route so we can add the ID to the person document after it saves. So going back to routes, we scroll down to comment. This is our final endpoint so far. We're going to say comment model dot create. We're going to pass in the request body function error. This time it's going to return the result is comments. You can name it whatever you want. If there's an error, return an error. Otherwise, we're going to do some more stuff here. So if there was no error, we want to say person model. So it was created successful at this point. We want to say person model save. No, we want to say person model get by ID. We're going to pass in the request body because we expect the request body to have an ID in it. So what we're going to do next is we're going to say function result. And after we get that, again, we do want to check to make sure that there was no error. If there was no error, you know what? Actually, we want to say this is person. So keep it consistent. So we're going to say person dot comments. So remember, it has an array in it. We're going to say push comment.id because remember, comment now has an ID on it. So we're going to push the ID into that array. We do want to make sure that array exists. So we're going to say if person.comments, we're going to say person.comments equals empty array. Because if the array doesn't exist, Couchbase isn't going to save it. It's a wasted space right there. So if it doesn't exist, we're going to create it. So we push that item to the array. We also want to say person.id equals request.body.id. And then what we want to do is we want to save it. Person model.save. I'm going to pass in person function error results. Keep it singular to be consistent. And very good. So just to recap, because this is a wild function right here. First, we're creating a comment. We're taking the comment ID after. So we're creating the comment. We're getting the person that's passed in with the data. We are adding that particular comment ID to its list. We're saying, hey, this is the person ID we want to save for. We're saving that person and we're returning now the new result. But actually the result should be person results, because remember when we save, it's just going to be a compare and swap value. So let's go ahead and test it out. See if we don't have any errors at this point. So we do want to grab the ID of this person. So I copied it. This is going to be a post request against the comment endpoint. The body is going to be a JSON body. In this case, we are expecting an ID, what I just copied, and then a message. This is a test. And let's see if it worked. It did not work, so comment model is not defined. So remember, at the top of this, I imported person model. I never imported comment model. All right, so I'm going to reboot it, and we're going to try it again. I'm going to click send. All right, so it just saved it. We're going to go to the dashboard here and make sure that it's there. So this is the comment that was just created. And if we look at our person document, you'll notice that comments is an array of ID. So that's good so far. So now if I go to get request for all people and run it, you'll notice that comment has now been expanded because of our NQL query that contained a complex subquery in it. So if you were to do this in a different kind of NoSQL database, it would have probably been particularly complicated in certain circumstances. But we had that flexibility of using a query language for this JSON data. So you just saw how to build a very simple API. It had only 4 endpoints, but it was actually quite easy to do.